welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm with uh, Julian Assele. Yeah. I think I always mispronounced it Assele like it was Spanish, but as you corrected me, it's French Ghanaian. So um, we are talking about the works of my favorite Catholic philosopher, uh, Alasdair MacIntyre. And McIntyre is like Lash, and he's one of the two figures that I've read as a leftist and a rightist. I read After Virtue when I was still consider myself a paleo conservative, probably around 2002. And I read Marxism and Christianity. I actually did a couple episodes on it way back, probably around 2015. But McIntyre's interesting. I kept on noticing like all my favorite books, whether they were left or right, from like if they were published in the United States and they were forgotten, I usually found like a McIntyre endorsement, and that also includes a bunch of Marxist work that people often forget that he endorsed after he left Marxism. So it wasn't unique to his Marxist period. I'm going to give a brief biographical philosophical sketch on McIntyre so people can kind of follow along. I think like in the circles he's big in, he's huge in, but in general, I don't think people really understand his trajectory, and they only really know After Virtue as a general rule. He was born in 1929. The motherfucker's almost 100 years old.
He's like 95.
I was posting pictures of him middle-aged to represent his Marxist period, and I realized, like, yeah, I mean, he wasn't a professor yet, but he was already like 40 by that point. So he's a Scottish-American philosopher. He's Scottish by birth. He's American by, I believe he was naturalized. He spent up into the 1960s in Britain, and most of, if you read his Marxist writings, they're all in the British milieu. But he became a professor at Brandeis in 1970. Before he moved to the United States, so he taught at Leeds, he taught at University of Essex, and he taught at Oxford. So he was there around. He was still a visiting professor at Princeton, and he is beloved by philosophically adroit Catholics. He's been awarded the American Catholic Philosophical Association's Aquinas Medal. Now, what is interesting about McIntyre, one, as a recent article portrayed, he hated the rich all his life. But two, he has a very interesting trajectory as far as his relationship to Marxism. He does critique Marxism. Some of his critiques of Marxism and Christianity I don't think are entirely fair. But I think he is one of the most penetrating thinkers on the problems with both overly rigid philosophical modes. I mean, he really was an analytical philosopher with a Hegelian bent as a Marxist during his teens. And it was Amiri Lakatos and Thomas Kuhn that pushed him away from that because he didn't think Marxist views of science were necessarily justifiable, right? this comes up in one of my favorite books of his, and I think it's one of your favorite too, Jules. And that is Whose Justice, Whose Rationality?
Yeah.
Which I think more people should read after they read After Virtue, because it contextualizes a lot of it in ways that make it clear that he's not just interested in like bringing St. Thomas Aquinas back from the dead and having us all live under his rule. After that, he wrote 3 rival visions of moral inquiry, Dependent Rational Animals, and his more recent works, I believe,
like Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, published in
right.
2016.
Right. So also he's still been publishing well into his 80s. So this is something to, I mean, it's kind of impressive. He converted to Catholicism around the time he wrote After Virtue, so he was a late convert. However, even in his earlier writing, he's fairly sympathetic to the religion point of view. I think his first book actually is on Marxism. And unfortunately, a lot of his early work I don't think is really available. A short history of ethics, which was originally written in 1966 and was revised by him in 1998, is still out. But his first book is Marxism, an Interpretation. He wrote in 1953. His second book with Anthony Flew, of all people, if people know who that guy is. If you don't, I can tell you, was New Essays in Philosophical Theology. So we're all really dealing with a guy, and this is a good 25 years before he converts to Catholicism, who thought that theology was actually worth taking seriously. He wrote a critique and analysis of the unconscious that I think kind of mirrors Sartre's. And he wrote A Secularization and Moral Change. Then he wrote Marxism and Christianity, which is his first break. Then he wrote The Religious Significance of Atheism with Paul Rigour, this is a book I have not read. He wrote an exposition, polemic, and kind of what we might now call a critical biography and engagement of Herbert Marcuse. He wrote another book on Marcuse in 1970. He wrote a book on Hegel in 1972, and then famously After Virtue. So I bring up his early work because his early work is kind of bracketed out even by himself, even his non-Marxist early work, partly because he kind of gave up on analytic philosophy too. So that is the biographical sketch. One of the things about McIntyre I think we're going to have to talk about is that his politics today are actually kind of hard to map onto traditional political categories, even if you include something like red Toryism, because he's not really a conservative in any sense.
He does not like calling himself a communitarian either.
No, he accepts the label only reluctantly and with great protest.
Yeah.
Although he is philosophically probably closer to Michael Sandel than anyone else I can think of on the current schema, other than like Abscom or some of the other virtue ethicists. I don't even know that he would still call himself a neo-Thomist.
No, he's he kind of takes a leaf out of Herbert McCabe's book. Herbert McCabe being this Catholic philosopher and Dominican friar who was also a Marxist back in the 60s and 70s, and he died in 2001. He was a close friend of McIntyre's, and McCabe used to say that he did not like to call himself a Thomist. He liked to think of himself as thinking with Thomas, but not necessarily as following Thomas, as though his argument is like a reified doctrine of propositions and theses. You actually see a very similar thing with McIntyre and his argument in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, where McIntyre says the thing he likes about Thomas is that his argument, the Summa, all 2,000 some odd pages of it, is essentially dialectical. It is like every question is sort of proposed with the assumption that there is no set answer to that question, because Thomas is trying to synthesize different traditions, such as is the Islamic philosophy, Augustinianism, Aristotelianism, and
although to some degree, Islamic philosophy and Aristotelianism are redundant. But go
right.
ahead.
Well, with Thomas, and what McIntyre likes about Thomas is that Thomas is very much like he is not trying to set forth a demonstrative argument like, say, Descartes would, where Descartes, and this is a passage in Whose Justice, where Descartes thinks, I think, therefore I am, with the assumption that once one makes that step, they fully apprehend that step. Whereas for McIntyre and his critique of Descartes, and what Aquinas' critique of Descartes would be, is it's essentially demonstrative but not dialectical. Like, a human does not understand a fact and then completely understand that fact. What usually happens is, we kind of understand this fact, and then a little bit further into our experience and into our argument, we have a better comprehension and apprehension of that fact, and then it changes the argument, and it's almost like a spiral that keeps going upwards and upwards and upwards, closer to the truth.
Yeah, one of the things I think that we have to delineate is pre-German idealist dialectics and what it is, because dialectical modes of reasoning are ancient.
I mean, goes way back.
Yeah, what we would now call the Hindu, and that in itself, applied that far back, as actually kind of anachronistic, but what we would now call the Hindu tradition has a dialectical form. The Abhidharmic tradition in Buddhism is dialectical, as is the argumentation of like the Galupa school of Vajrayana Buddhism. What dialectics is an open-ended inquiry where the terms are not already defined, because they can't be, they're contested. So and to go back into like a very, very old, I mean, we're going back to ancient Greece here. The distinction between the dialectic and analytic is dealing with philosophy where terms are more or less axiomatically agreed upon. You can make statements and they can have meaning because we agree that the axioms we are using are true. So we can make, all kinds of clear statements. When the meaning is contested, like in most of the public dialogues of Plato, and we don't have Plato's non-dialogic and also non-dialectic writing, although we are told it existed. One can see this as well. So this is why I get frustrated with like this is dialectics as a kind of like folk magic or something that you get in a lot of like modern post 20th century leftism, because it's like, well, it's the synthesis of contradictions, and by contradictions we mean this. And while dialectics after German idealism does mean something different, basically what Kant and Hegel are trying to do in their conceptions of dialectics is argue that instead of in an argument, history itself is doing the dialectical process. So it's not just a temporary process, right? It's like the movements of history are actually clarifying the concepts closer and closer to what the absolute idea is. The absolute idea will only manifest itself negatively because humans have free will, because the absolute idea is God.
Right. And the reason,
in a Marxism that's flipped, we don't assume that this is building towards God or whatever. Marx is, I think, a fairly teleological thinker. He does seem to think that like either socialism or common ruin is inevitable. He doesn't seem to think there's any other way things can go, except for when he does in his late life. But definitely in young Marx, he's clearly like this. But the difference is he thinks that ideas emerge from human interaction with the world, etc. I only bring that up because dialectics is a word that's thrown around a lot on the left, and it makes their brain turn off. And so every time I mention it now in a context like with McIntyre, I know what you're talking about. You know what you're talking about. I just want people to know that we're not using dialectics as a magic word to shut your brain off.
That happens too much. I mean, and it dovetails very well with why when McIntyre calls Aquinas's sort of like long argument dialectical, what he means is that it's a real movement. It is a movement towards something. And McIntyre likes this because movement, to put it kind of in a vulgar sense, is activity. And McIntyre is very heavily influenced by, the early Marx, especially like, say, the Theses on Feuerbach, where McIntyre often talks about how the point of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change the world. And part of McIntyre's project is to sort of desegregate morality from this kind of it being a separate sphere of life, as like Kant or other kind of, say, liberal thinkers would put it, trying to integrate the is and the ought. And McIntyre believes that, or as a virtue ethicist, believes that one cannot understand the world without participating in the world.
Right.
Or to put in more Marxist terminology, while theory and praxis are not just two separate spheres, but are one in the same movement.
So for McIntyre, I mean, we're going to be stressing the ways in which there's a continuity with this early McIntyre, who's a Marxist in the first 20 years of his life, but there is a rupture. There's no way around that. There's a kind of reintegration. You and I both think, and I know some other people who think this, with Marxist-like ideas of history in very late McIntyre, so in the last 10 years. Some people will refer to this as a return to the left, but McIntyre doesn't think those terms have particular meaning for him because those terms come out of the Enlightenment and the removal of things from action and community. Right. So for McIntyre, one of the key problems with the Enlightenment is this tendency to clarify by reduction, right? Like, we're going to reduce everything to singular rules that we can operate on a rational principle, and
that every person across all cultures can understand.
Right. So both deontology and utilitarianism are the examples of that we can either calculate utils or we can formulate things according to a formulation that is a rule of which we can deduce all other rules. And McIntyre says not only is this transparently fucking stupid, to put it about as vulgarly as I can, it actually ends up inverting on itself very quickly and becoming either total relativism or emotivism. Now, I say total relativism because one of the interesting things about virtue philosophy that I point out to people is that it does actually posit a relative worldview, meaning different virtues exist for different reasons. People can be moral actors and act morally and actually be directly in conflict, which is something you get the feeling that this doesn't so much come up in After Virtue, but it does come up in...
It definitely comes up in Dependent Rational Animals and in Whose Justice, especially in his conversation about morality being a technique, or in the Greek, like techne.
Right.
Like essentially for McIntyre, morality is not just some like armchair exercise or like a series of case studies. It's something that you have to live through. Like a lot of liberal philosophers take, like, let's say Descartes. I don't want to call him a liberal philosopher, but this is someone who a lot of them tend to take from. morality starts within the individual and then is imported into the world. It starts with the mind and then goes into the world. Whereas for McIntyre, he believes, and I tend to agree with him, that this posits a kind of contradiction between the individual and society, the particular interest versus the universal interest. And McIntyre takes a lot from Aristotle in saying that humans are social animals, or in terms of his book here, they're dependent rational animals. And what that means here is that there is no individual without the society, and then there is no society without the individual. What does that mean? You need a language. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean he comes to something that for all of our critiques, and we can have many of Hegel, including Hegel being kind of more individualist in this, but Hegel does kind of immediately point out that, like, both through conflict and community, that it is not meaningful to have an individual without another and without something from which you are modeling and or contrasting and differentiating yourself from. So literally, Ed McIntyre is a good reader of Hegel, although that's not where he gets it. He goes back even further and gets it from Aristotle. And and it's one of these funny things where I'm always like, yeah, pull moral philosophy from Aristotle and maybe some epistemology, because his science is stupid. But well, actually, when I say his science is stupid, I should actually say his science was brilliant, but in almost all cases, not all cases, but in almost all cases, wrong. And our weird contention with Aristotle today is kind of like our contention with Plato. We reduce Plato down to the dialogues and ignore that there's actually a pretty complicated theology and esoteric knowledge set that is mentioned implicitly and explicitly throughout his text, and we just like pretend that's not important to him, and it seems to be that's the primary importance. Similarly with Aristotle, Aristotle thought he was doing natural philosophy in this context, and also theology and a bunch of other stuff, but basically like coming up with a set of series of rules that made knowledge comprehensible across the board. We don't read him like that. We tend to read him as a guy who invented predicate philosophy, like maybe some ethical categories.
And if I may, I want to kind of briefly explain what I mean when I say like Aristotle's dictum of like humans being social animals, which is what McIntyre's whole kind of shtick is, and what he uses to implode the notion of like, here's the individual and here's society. So basically what he kind of means here is, what is it that makes humans humans? Language, essentially, for McIntyre. That's essentially what kind of boils down for like rationality for him, is the ability to make ourselves intelligible not only to others but also to ourselves. Because how can you have kind of thoughts or like predicates or words or like language or like symbols that transcend your individuality without language?
How do you would you have language without sociality?
Right. How do you acquire a language? It's not how a lot of, say, liberal philosophers start from, where you contract yourselves into associations of people. No, you are born into a community. You acquire a language by inhabiting a way of life. And you are born into a set of ever influx customs and mores and traditions that at first you may adopt, or at first you're like faced with, but as time goes on, the goal to being a fully individualized human person is being able to use your rationality to adopt those traditions or mores, or to repudiate them, or to change them, but in any case, becoming a fully actualized individual rational thinker. And that's only possible by being born into a community. This is why Aristotle in the Politics in the first book, this is why he says that a human being without a community is like a hand without a human body. It's no longer a hand. Think of, say, every once in a while there's the news story of a person who is kept in a cage or in a basement for like 10 years, and they appear more animal than they do human because they're unable to like articulate themselves because they don't have language that transcends their individuality. which is where this is where a lot of the Wittgenstein comes in.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would say to that is, I mean, in some of the cases of humans isolated like that, I feel like they don't even feel animal. They feel subjugated even beyond that.
Yeah, that's a good way of articulating it.
Like, and this is why it's so hard to imagine, like, what would a human be if they were completely isolated? Well, what we probably find is they'd make a community out of like projections, like kinship with inanimate objects and animals, because it's literally almost impossible to imagine a human surviving completely asocially. I mean, for one, for reasons of complex biological development, we are useless for the first 3 years of our lives.
Yeah.
Like all other, like even other mammals, and mammals are more dependent on their parents than most other forms of life. But most other mammals, with the exception of some primates, don't birth things with giant heads that you literally have to birth premature, that's totally dependent on you because you can't gestate them to, I don't know, toddler size like a calf would be gestated without dying. So that's unique to humans, or it's at least unique to primates, and it's even amongst primates. And this is an insight Marx actually has that I think is really, really important. But it goes all the way back to Aristotle, and Marx is a Hegelian Aristotelian in his early life. Well, he's a Hegelian Aristotelian, particularly interested in Epicureanism. That's what he did his pre-political work on, to be completely
that was his thesis. Humans being sensual animals.
Right. And based off of Epicurus, but he's reading Epicurus through Aristotle and Hegel. Regardless, the whole insight there is that even compared to our primate relatives, as individuals, without mediating technology and communication being the big one, even more important than our thrones, we kind of suck at surviving. Like, in a very real sense, a chimpanzee can rip our face off. We cannot rip their face off back without technology or help from another human.
The only thing humans, I think, have over most animals is we're like really good long distance runners. But I think that's pretty much the only purely physical attribute that we have over most animals.
Yeah, and I think that's something to consider. And then only most. We would not even be apex at that by far.
Right.
Like, so this is something that I think, you know, if you're not convinced by the theological elements of this argument, and that is a consideration for McIntyre, we are not dropping that out. It's still, what he's saying is very true. And this whole antinomy between collective and individual, I used to get really mad at, because when people talk about, oh, there's collectivist and individualist societies, and I'm like, okay, maybe if you're talking about Europe, like Sweden versus the United States, but in most places in the world that I have lived, that doesn't mean that much. And when it's encountered, it's kind of imposed.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because also the collectivist presupposes an individual that is isolated. And the more you study anything like developmental anthropology or whatever, and I have my critiques of anthropology, not to go off on that, but I want people to know I'm not naive about this. But you see that, like, yeah, most societies, even relatively egalitarian ones, see individuality and collective identity as cohesive and informing, and that's important to understand. Now, what is interesting, now I've been told that you know, I had an indigenous friend of mine read After Virtue, and he said that McIntyre kind of slightly misunderstands some of the stuff about the
Polynesians.
But that he misunderstands it based on common history and anthropology at the time. So he doesn't know, like, if we should hold McIntyre accountable for that, but that there is some truth to it. And so I guess we do have to come to one of the key points in McIntyre's moral and political thinking, which is his concept of moral disorder and what causes it. So you want to talk about that?
I think that'd be a great idea. And I think this actually dovetails very well with the animal discussion, because rationality, what essentially makes rationality so powerful is it allows humans to step back from their immediate desires or sensations. So when a dog sees a juicy steak, they think, they don't think this, but this is kind of what they feel is, oh, I'm hungry. I want that steak. But human beings are the only animals who are able to take a step back and think, whose steak is this? Should I eat this steak? I'm kind of hungry right now, but I don't really feel like eating. I don't know. And this kind of ability to take a step back from our sensations is the thing that allows us to sort of transcend our individuality and what makes humans social animals, because we're able to take a step back from the narrow and particular interests of the animal and are able to establish long form associations to put this back to like in more Marxian terminology. And this is something he makes clear in the manuscripts and in Capital. And it's a metaphor I think is very interesting, and one I'd love to kind of write more about or read more about, is this thing about what makes animals animals and humans humans. And he has this important metaphor in Capital Volume 1 where he says, what separates the best of bees from the worst of engineers is that the bee builds by instinct. He is immediately identified with his life activity. He builds hives. He makes and consumes honey. The worst of engineers, they're really bad at making buildings, but they're able to take a step aside and conceptualize before they execute what they need to do. Now, there's like a spectrum to this, of course. There are many animals, like, dolphins or other primates who are essentially pre-linguistic, who have primitive modes of communication that allow them to basically produce sounds or produce signs that allow them to kind of communicate how they feel or that sort of thing. And this is a point that McIntyre makes in Dependent Rational Animals. Dolphins, the thing that separates dolphins from humans in terms of sociality is that a dolphin can still flourish without having to argue or reflect upon the meaning of dolphin flourishing, unlike humans. And this is where the virtues come in, which we can talk about now or a little bit later.
Well, I mean, we should talk about what virtues are. One, I always tell people, when people ask me, like, is virtue ethics consequentialist or deontological? And I'm like, no. Bad question. Wrong question. Not even helpful.
Yeah, not a good question.
Like, one, virtues are not just moral virtues. They're anything that you can model and has a power. Two, how do we know that virtues work? Well, because we have a model for them. That model is usually in some heroic figure or some kin figure or whatever, often quite mythic, but it's a model. Three, no one expects virtues to be coherent. Virtues have different needs in different historical and social contexts, meaning that also different parts of society and different groups would have different virtues. And actually, interestingly, when Marxists, whether they're Marxist, Leninist, or Trotskyist, or Maoist, have talked about ethics at all, which they generally avoid like the plague, this is the framework they talk about it in. I mean, you think about Trotsky's pamphlet, Their Virtues and Ours. This was also picked up by Iron Felix, so this is not just a Trotskyist thing. There are virtues and morality, for the communist man or the proletarian or whatever. And they are context derived, but what makes a virtue is that they are embodied and part of a social world. Now, McIntyre extends this to like a traditional world that is coherent, not because it is logically coherent, not in the like analytic sense, but more in the maybe you're right to bring up Wittgenstein earlier, more in the Wittgensteinian sense is like we recognize these things as things we do in a cluster of things that is meaningful in our social life, in our modes of production and reproduction, in our modes of values, etc.
Right, like McIntyre is not into tradition because he's a traditionalist. McIntyre is into tradition because he essentially conceives of tradition as like a way of life and a form of living that is ever changing and is open to change. This is essentially why McIntyre likes Aquinas, because like the Summa, you know, the form that the argument in the Summa takes, it is essentially an extended argument that takes generations and that people are partaking in and modify in different fashions according to how life changes.
So one thing that you have to take from McIntyre that I think is interesting is like when we talk about tradition or when we talk about ethics, even virtue ethics, he mocked the idea of ethics courses just outright, wrote a whole polemic against them. And the reason why he did is that one, he said they didn't work, but two, that they're decontextualized from actual life and that they kind of try to reduce things to rules or legalities. So either emotive, you know, constraints or legal constraints, but not much else. So it's either your aesthetic because you want to be in a good person, and this is your aesthetic to be a good person. You know, he kind of takes like the Carnapian view of ethics, like, and that's like what a lot of people's view really is. Like, when people always tell me like, how can you separate morality from politics? And on one hand, I actually agree you can't. On the other hand, they aren't the same thing. And when you conflate them, like, and when I say they aren't the same thing, no more than say, my lungs are me.
Yeah.
Like, or my microbiome are me. They are me. Like, they are part of me. They are also coherent things in and of themselves. Me and them cannot exist without each other. We are in a very real, like, I am an ecology in of to myself, but also they are not me in that to do that is a part the whole fallacy, right? And this is a lot of problems with modern left-wing thinking, is that I used to point this out all the time, that it reduces our moral response to either pure self-interest or aesthetics, and then it equates our political response and our moral response as the same thing, and then does not embed that in any community function really at all.
Yeah.
So
to a quick word on that, in the ethics, and one of the things I really like about the ethics is at the end of the book, McIntyre dedicates the last part of it to basically biographical sketches of four people. One of them being Sandra Day O'Connor, another one being Vasily Grossman, another one being CLR James, and the other one being what was his name? Oh, Dennis Fowle, who is an Irish priest. And one of the points McIntyre makes about CLR James, which I think does an excellent job of kind of summarizing like what he dislikes about a lot of mechanical Marxist approach to morality or ethics, is that for a lot of communists, when they try to talk to others about why they should be communists, because they don't really have a conception of what the human person is for or like what human flourishing is, they tend to kind of backtrack to crude utilitarianism of like, it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
yeah, and I know many Marxists who will say this outright as their ethical stance, and I'm just like, I don't know how you read Marx and say that. I can only cite like 50 footnotes against Bentham and Mill. Like,
whereas for CLR James, his why he was a communist was a bit deeper in that, because it was rooted in a firmer conception of like, what is the human person for?
Yeah, I mean, I have my critiques of CLR James,
Yeah.
but I tend to like him. But like, I think he does. I think he actually struggles with that. James, and I think towards the end of his life it's clearer. But like, if you read the Black Jacobins, he actually does a lot of parsing this way and that way to like make a narrative fit a kind of like bourgeois clear narrative about how national liberations work, and kind of softens the edges of Toussaint Louverture,
Yeah.
and kind of just avoids an actual discussion of the of why Dessalines massacred the whites, but like not most of them actually. Like, um and but he does this partly for Marxist reasons, I think partly for moral reasons, because CLR James does kind of get that, particularly after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's this tendency in Marxism to pretend that not only does, this is all science and obvious and just it should be clear to everyone, and anyone who has an objection to it is guilty of false consciousness, but also, which is kind of ironic actually, because false consciousness is a term that like Engels and Marx use a few times, but it's
Yeah.
really more used by Lukács. But Lukács interestingly does talk about things like proletarian virtue and stuff, so I don't know. But by the time you get to like the 1950s, it's sort of like the ends justify the means, but the ends never really happen.
Yeah.
And so there you go. And I know there's a lot of alienated people right now who reach to that particular form of Marxism as a way to differentiate themselves from both anti-communism and the prior popular forms like the DSA. And they'll say, well, but it's what won. And I'm like, hey, the Soviet Union didn't last 3 generations.
Yeah. What happened next?
like just there are people, there are not that many of them anymore, but there are people alive who were born when that happened. And there are definitely people who are alive who remember the 30s and 40s. So, they're a dying breed, but, and I actually think, one of my unpopular, people will say, okay, boomer takes, but I actually think that is part of why we get these like ridiculous caricatures of the left and right of like societies prior to the 1960s, is because like we live in a very media saturated world where we've outsourced a lot of our cultural memory to very presentist media. And in fact,
Yeah.
sometimes so much so that people don't remember what happened 10 fucking years ago. Um,
Oh yeah, but to bring it back to CLR James, because I like what
Go
you
ahead.
kind of said about James and what McIntyre. One of the big points he draws out of James in his biography, in the Ethics, is James's love for cricket, the sport of cricket. Uh, James was obsessed with cricket back when he was younger and throughout his life, really. And he wrote a book, a series of essays on cricket. I forgot the name of the title, but it was one of his more major works. And one of the things that McIntyre draws out with playing cricket and like thinking about virtue is that essentially one can conceive of ethics as like how to play life, in the same sense that how to play cricket or to be a good cricket player, and understanding the rules of life, just as understanding the rules of cricket does not actually make one a good cricket player or a good human being. That's a very legalistic understanding of what it means to be a good human or what it means to be a good cricket player. Um, what it means to be a good cricket player has to be discovered through the game in a framework of rules agreed upon by all parties, uh, and being able to refine those skills and those attributes that make one a good cricket player. Just because you say you can't go out of bounds doesn't mean, oh, I didn't go out of bounds, I'm a good cricket player. Just like, say, you shouldn't murder, you don't murder people, that doesn't make you necessarily a good person.
Right. I mean, always interesting is to ask yourself, how did a formerly Trotskyist Pan-Africanist Marxist write uh, towards the end of his life a moving autobiography on cricket? And and you're right. I mean, I think the book is called Beyond the Boundary,
Yes.
and of the two things written by CLR James, which is the Black Jacobins, number one, and number two, uh, which I believe actually McIntyre has blurbed. But in number two is his cricket book, and I think that's interesting. I mean, CLR James is a fascinating character, like altogether, and that like he was a diehard Pan Africanist his entire life and a diehard anti-racist. But also like wrote a lot about how influenced he was by European history and culture, and how he couldn't, like, he had no want to completely remove that from his life. Um, and um, you know, he was a Trotskyist in the 30s, and you know, did a speaking tour in the U.S. He met Trotsky, then kind of gave up on Trotsky, left with Max Chapman, ended up in the Forrest Johnson tendency, ended up hanging out with Rudijuskaya, left with, you know, left and formed his own tendency, went back to Britain. I mean, a fascinating guy, and somebody that someone like McIntyre would be fascinated with. Also, weirdly, was uh, was into Oswald Spengler before he became a Marxist as a child. Like
Yeah.
CLR James is a weird dude, but I think it's interesting because he was not, even when he tried to be, a mechanistic Marxist, and this has been something I've been pushing back on, because there's two tendencies in the mechanic Marxist camp. There's a structuralist tendency, which tries to take all the teleology out but keep all the teleology in simultaneously. By that I mean it kind of does the thing where it found structures and gives the structures at the high level causal agency and this and the other. It's the stuff that E.P. Thompson mocked, particularly in Althusser, but and then there's this other tendency, kind of an analytic Marxism, is to reduce Marxism down to morality, but then to kind of, but if we define morality in the right way, we can do morality objectively. And both these tendencies, actually, even in his Marxist phase, are things that McIntyre reacts strongly against. And in fact,
Yeah.
he talks about, like, well, a lot of the attempts to undo the is-ought distinction in Hume, that's, he's got a whole essay on that in this book, actually weirdly still end up problematic, because they just want to get rid of the ought entirely for the is and try to pretend that they're the same thing. Whereas, you know, for, like when I said that metaphor about my lungs and me, or my microbiome and me, for Alasdair MacIntyre, neither of those things really make sense. It neither makes sense to say that the ought is somehow numinously removed from the, you know, from the is, the way, the thing in itself and the thing for itself, you know, are different. We can know the thing, or we can know the thing, the thing in the world, but we can't know the thing in itself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Marx just thinks, I mean, not Marx, McIntyre just thinks these separations are ridiculous, and so does Marx. But his criticism of Marx is that Marx just goes to the ought most of the time. Although, if anyone's actually read a lot of the scholarship on Marx, he's not consistent about that. He does that in certain works and not others. So
Yeah.
it's very clear in the early works, which McIntyre likes, but even in Das Kapital, that he's doing that. But if you read the journalistic works of the letters, sometimes he feels that way and sometimes he doesn't. Marx is not always the most consistent person in the world. Sorry, Marxist humanist. but that's Marxist humanist with a dash. Apparently, that dash matters.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a long digression. I think. I mean, one of the things I remember when I first read, what you're calling ethics, is that After Virtue?
The ethics and the conflicts of modernity.
Okay, the newest, the most recent.
That's when he does the 4 biographies.
Okay, yeah, I was about to say I don't remember that in After Virtue, but it's one of the McIntyre pieces I haven't read. But I think now after this, I'm going to have to.
It's wonderful. It's great.
Him writing about CLR James at the end of his life is actually instructive. So,
and he does it. He does it right after writing about Sandra Day O'Connor. It's so fun. It's a fun part of the book.
But what is interesting with McIntyre versus, say, a figure like Christopher Lasch, like you and I talked about Christopher Lasch. I'm a Lasch defender. You're a Lasch warrior, but I actually do see with you that there's a shift in Lasch that he's not acknowledging. That does seem to move him from his early writings in the 60s and 70s into something completely different by the early 90s when he dies. And while even the Revolt of the Elites, I think, has left-wing elements still in it, I don't think it's a completely right-wing book. You see a whole lot of things in there that are more conductive to the right of the 1990s. I don't know if he would have stayed that way. I mean, the more I study Lasch, the more I actually think he's really hard to place on our current political spectrums. And most people who are doing so are literally just using him to get back at liberals.
Yeah.
But with McIntyre, it's interesting because the break is acknowledged and clear, and it happens about, I mean, it feels like the beginning of his career, but only because apparently he's immortal. Because like it really happens around his 50s.
Yeah.
So it's something to think about when you're thinking about a person who has been conceived of and loved by the right. A lot of right wingers love After Virtue. A lot of them do. I don't. Yeah. This is why I was like, said people need to read Whose Justice, Whose Rationality, Independent Rational Animals, because it will contextualize some of that for you. But as he ages, you see a lot of his early concerns from his Marxist period come back, as you were talking about with that CLR James. So he actually does see the world in this historical way in which virtue, like, one of the interesting things that I think is implied in Alasdair MacIntyre's writings is even if he wanted to be a Thomist, he can't be. He can't be an Aquanian because he doesn't live in that context. That's not the community he can be embodied in. And if he wants to embody a community with virtues, it cannot be, even from his Catholic perspective, the same one as St. Thomas had.
Right. I mean, this is something important that what I really like what he does in Whose Justice, Which Rationality is he has a large section where he talks about David Hume, but before he gets to Hume, he spends like 80 or 90 some odd pages talking about the historical context of 18th century Scotland and Roman Dutch jurisprudence and the efforts of Scottish jurists and philosophers to either break out of the bonds of English philosophy or to integrate into that kind of imperialist sort of way of thinking back then with the British. Mm-hmm. And he offers like a really interesting biography of David Hume. Like he's charitable towards Hume. Like he doesn't call him an idiot. He says he's very smart. But he does note that there are certain blind spots in his thinking that he roots back to like the social conditions in which he grew up. For instance, throughout most of his life, David Hume did his best to shed his Scottish background to become English.
Right.
Same thing with Edmund Burke and how he was Irish and how he repudiated a great deal of his Irish heritage in basically being pro-British imperialism. And that's what I think is where you see a lot of Marx comes in, where McIntyre does not deal with these historical figures as a bunch of rootless ideas floating in the ether, but are instead rooted in these social conditions, not necessarily reflecting these social conditions, but are individuals who are trying to make sense of and survive in these different historical conditions.
One of the things that I think that I got that I think is contextualized in Independent Rational Animals and in Whose Justice, Whose Rationality, but I think is really important. So a lot of people think one of the biggest critiques that McIntyre has is his critique of emotivism. But emotivism for him is not the like clear distinction between emotions and reason, because that doesn't make really sense to him either.
No.
But what emotivism is kind of a philosophical doctrine where, since we are not dealing with our social embodiedness, basically aesthetics, emotional responses, which is what, have to be where we get our morality from. And this is open for him to easy manipulation. And in fact, he says, I'll just quote After Virtue here. This is on page 23. The key to the social content of emotivism is the fact that emotivism entails the obliteration of any genuine distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations. So what does that mean? Well, if everything that you have is about your response to, say, your group belonging, not your embodiment in the group and protection of that group, but this sense of projected identity of what you have to that group, right? And the most obvious and banal example of this is race and racism, etc. But in general, an embodied social relationship is with people who you actually see your future with and eat together with.
Yeah, it's not what I should do, but it's what we should do.
Yeah, what we should do. Whereas if you're in an emotive context, this is easily manipulable, because the context and deliberation of the we, of me as part of the we, and the way I can deliberate that can be manipulated by a projection of an identity that supposedly stands in for the we. I take this deeper than McIntyre. I think it stands in for symbolic kinship, but is a form of manipulation of symbolic kinship. But this projected, we as leftists believe blank. But anyone can say and speak as the we, and since there's no community of which you're sitting at the table and can say that motherfucker's an outsider, you can't really protect yourself against that either. But it can pull on your emotions in any sort of way. So it's not that the emotions are the problem. It's the fact that we rely mostly on our emotive responses, often hiding them from McIntyre and pseudo responses.
Yeah. And McIntyre makes clear, he makes this clear in a lot of his late work, but especially in the Ethics, that this kind of thinking really comes into its form under modernity. And what he means by modernity is those communities and those social relations that are undergirded by private property relations of making contracts with others, where there is no more the corporate community. And by corporate, I don't mean corporation, but I mean corporate as in the whole community, right. An organism.
But he also imposes...
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was about to say, but instead, a bunch of different individuals who are coming into relations with each other. And not only that, and this is very important, but McIntyre has this understanding of compartmentalization, which I think is crucial, a very crucial insight that he has that complements a lot of Marxist thinking, which is to say that under private property relations, you have these different spheres of life. What do we mean by that? Well, back during the, let's say, a medieval village, you had the economy, and there wasn't really a strong demarcation between the public and the private, because the home economy, the base element of it, was the home. Uh, but then, as the economy, or the motor of the economy, slowly came out of the home into the workshop and then the factory, there began to create this kind of set of like different spheres of life. Where, for instance, um, you when I am a, say, working as a Starbucks barista, and you, Varn, come in for a drink, you do not confront me as Varn. You confront me as a customer, and I confront you as a barista, and we do not see each other as full integrated human beings. We see each other only in the role in which we inhabit. And this is the chief thing that kind of characterizes modernity, is the fragmentation of man, in the inability to integrate all these different small selves that we inhabit in all these different spheres of life into one being.
Right. I mean, in some ways, this picks up from Marx, the alienation problem, but actually, I would say it probably goes a little bit deeper than Marx, because in Marx, you know, Marx doesn't delineate it this way, but if you read the early philosophical manuscripts, it's really clear that Marx talks about 4 forms of alienation: alienation from your labor,
Yep.
alienation from your
From yourself, from others.
from others, from others both in general and others from other workers, because you're in competition with them. But
Yes.
McIntyre actually takes this and goes further. But it's not just alienation from our labor. We actually now have to we have to reflect within ourselves the division of labor in a way that, yes, other societies have had divisions of labor, but they have not asked us to fragment ourselves to reflect that, so that we are a completely different instantiation in this form when we're doing this function than in this form when we're doing this function.
Right. And this is what makes possible the notion of like morality being a fundamentally different sphere from politics. Because, say, in ancient Greece, this is something that'd be a bit of an odd conception to have. Like, take reading the Iliad, which McIntyre has an extended commentary on the Iliad of the different ways in which translators from the 15th century, the 18th century, and the 20th century translate how Achilles is able to sort of think through his anger. And we as modern readers read the Iliad, and we think, oh, Achilles, he's very angry, and he uses his rationality to select from these different choices of what he ought to do, and then he chooses that, and then he does that thing. Whereas for like the ancient Greeks, it is more like, because Achilles occupies this certain role in the social hierarchy as a warrior aristocrat and as a well-educated, and by educated I don't mean he went to college, of course, but I mean like a well morally formed person. He just knows what he has to do. And the only thing that is left to him to do is not to choose from all these different things, to like pick and choose like a rational individual actor that we conceive of like 18th century philosophy, but instead he just has to summon the thumos, the will to accomplish the thing that he already knows that he ought to do, as according to his role as a warrior aristocrat fighting this conflict. So you have morality and religion and aesthetics being integrated into kind of one general sphere.
Which I think is fair enough. I mean, one of the things I would say to that I think, like, and again, we keep on making this body metaphor because I don't really have a better one. But the general sphere is like, yes, there are different, you have different functions in society as a leader, and it's not like in pre-modern societies, and to be for people who go, oh, McIntyre's Eurocentric. Yes, but also no, he does actually mention non-European societies a fair amount in these books. he is Christian though, so you do have to take that into account. But he 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 does seem to imply that like these conceptual schemas are parts of wholes that, yes, we know like when a person is functioning as a politician, but we do not expect them to act as a politician in this sphere of life and then go home and then do this completely different thing.
Right.
There is a distinction between public and private in a lot of these societies, but even that is probably too modern, right? Like,
Right.
a way to conceptualize that. I know we have broken down the distinction between public and private, but I think that's really crucial. I think that is that really clear in is it whose justice and whose rationality, or after virtue, where he talks about that the most? I'm trying to remember.
He talks the most about the Iliad comparison in Whose Justice, Which Rationality.
Right. I kind of read those two books together as like a cluster. So like,
Yeah.
I often forget what things and what they're. I think this is important because he thinks like this is why a lot of things don't work. But let's talk about why he rejects the notion of communitarian or of corporatist, because we talked about his despair over the breakup of the corporate society, and by corporate we do not mean corporation in the limited liability sense. But this, I think, led to a lot of people who are basically fascistic, if not out and out fascist, to be attracted to him because they are corporatist or integralist. And if anyone knows what that means in philosophy, this is an attempt to get class collaboration together to build an integrated state from the standpoint of the state down.
The workers have their place. The capitalists have their place, and so on and so forth. It's like the way a lot of fascists like to put it is like it's like a human body, but it's the reactionary conception of the human body is like the brain is for thinking, and then the hand does what the brain says.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Exactly. So the brain is the leader who controls the otherwise developing and problematic elites. Scares them in the shape. They all function together. There is justice in that the workers get what their due share is, but of course that's actually a lesser portion. And there is some pushback on capitalist. But when people are always like to me, X state kills their capitalists, that means that they're more socialister than we are. And I'm always like, fascists killed capitalists, my friend.
Yeah.
Like that's all kinds of people kill capitalists. That doesn't tell you
that is not a socialist signature move.
Yeah, that doesn't tell you anything. Actually, capitalists kill capitalists. Even we don't tend to. Our government, our state doesn't tend to do it here that much, but it used to.
Right.
So I think this is a kind of interesting development. Now, the one thing I will say that you do have to kind of deal with in McIntyre, that may be a hard thing for non-religious people to follow, is his idea of like biological teleology. So
yeah, he talks a lot about that in Dependent Rational Animals, and it's very much like he doesn't really reference God in it, but he's very much like, look, humans are animals. They're like dolphins. He does not try to say that human beings are special insofar as we're somehow above dolphins or other animals, or like we have souls and they don't. What he's trying to say is that by virtue of how we've kind of evolved, there are certain conditions in which we can say we objectively flourish more in others, in such a sense in which, like, in the ethics, he says, like, if you put a set of gorillas in the Arctic, they're not going to flourish. And what does flourishing mean? Well, for McIntyre, he defines it as flourishing being the exercise of those particular animal or particular powers that, say, a gorilla or any other animal has. For obvious reasons, gorillas would not flourish in the Arctic. Same thing with humans, where there is a spectrum of environments in a spectrum of different environments in which human beings flourish and in which human beings do not flourish.
Yeah, and if we encounter environments where we don't flourish, we figure out artificial ways. This is where
This is what makes human beings the universal animal.
Right. Animals do this too. For people who think that I don't realize that, don't at me. I do realize that animals modify their environment. Some of them do severely. Go meet a pack of termites sometimes. But it's actually interesting because one of the things that McIntyre does is, while he does, I think he doesn't mention God. He does not try to root this in any God thinking, although he clearly does think this is a implication, inconsistent with Christianity. But what's interesting and different from him than like other Christian philosophers, he actually talks about like humans can learn from watching animals like engage and maximize their flourishing and how they act and interact with each other. They can also learn bad things from it, but we can learn it.
That's what makes us rational, is our ability to take a step back from our life activity and understand or incorporate like the different parts of the life activities of other animals.
So, and this is basically, for those of you who hadn't realized, this is basically Aristotle made less stupid.
There's also a lot of Marx in the manuscripts, since he talks a lot about the animal and what makes humans the universal animal.
Right. And like social constraints on species being in like one of the things in Marx that I think people get tired of me bringing up at this point because I brought it up so many times. But in Marx, it's not that there's no human nature; it's that human nature is always mediated through sociality by its nature. So it's very hard to say what is pure human nature outside of social construct, because there is no human outside of social construct. That's part of what it means to be human.
Right. Human beings are the only animals who like can be tricked into doing something that is bad for their long-term survival. Like monkeys are like, you can put like drugs in like monkeys or mice kind of food and make them act stupid, but you can't really trick a monkey into not eating food in the way you can trick a human into, not trick, but argue a human into engaging in behaviors that is bad for their long-term flourishing.
Yeah, there's another example of this that I always talk about when I'm talking about like okay, so you think that what makes humans special is mechanical rationality, our ability to make tools. Yeah, complicate that for you. If I sit down with a chimp and make a device that gives them food, and it's mechanically complicated, and I model it for them, and in that modeling, I include steps that are unnecessary. A monkey, a chimp, will eventually drop those unnecessary steps. It will manipulate it enough to realize the unnecessary steps and drop them away. Human beings do not drop the unnecessary steps. No, we come up with a rationale about why the unnecessary steps are actually necessary.
Right.
From the now, this seems completely perverse and maybe even anti-evolutionary until you realize that part of what's going on there is we assume high levels of social trust, like naturally with our immediate, whatever. Now outsiders, free fucking game is one of my things about. I always talk about Hobbes. When we act alienated, we do act Hobbesian. And when we compete between groups, we are totally Hobbesian. But in our relationships with other human beings, even without a government, as long as we see ourselves on a spectrum of relation with them, we do not act Hobbesian. Right. By that, I mean all against all. We just don't do that.
And to bring this back to the point about McIntyre not being a communitarian, when we talk about there are environments in which we can say human beings objectively will not flourish in, and human beings are some of the only animals that can be tricked or argued into engaging in behaviors or dispositions that is bad for their long-term survival or their community's long-term survival. This feeds into why McIntyre is not a communitarian
He doesn't
insofar
think
as
any community is actually good. Like he does think we can distinguish between flourishing and non-flourishing communities.
yeah, a good way of putting it here is that like food is necessary for our survival in the same way that uh, community is necessary for our long-term survival. That does not make all food equally as good for us as, say, all communities are equally good for us. For example, I could technically survive off of eating gruel and cardboard, technically. That's not good for me in the long term. Same thing with communities, like, say, um, the Jim Crow 1920s, 1910s small town in Alabama. That's not a very flourishing community. That's not a good community for a, not just for, the black members of that community.
It's really not great for anybody.
It's bad for everybody.
Like it brings out social pathologies even in the victors. Like
Yes. This is something James Baldwin talks about, where like the white Southerner is paranoid, extremely paranoid. And this goes back to 16th, 17th century Barbados, where white planters are often just have nightmares, just waking up terrified, thinking that they've just had a nightmare where like their slaves have finally revolted and are going to kill them. That is not the sign of a well-functioning, developing human being outflanked by paranoia and these things of like, oh no, they're going to do to me what I've been doing to them for like several decades now.
Yeah, so this is something that I think people miss. One thing I recently talked with my friend Jules Delisle. No, Jules Delisle. I'm going to pronounce her name right. Everyone's name I mess up. Is that there are a variety of ways in which humans live, but they do certain things and not others. But a lot of the way we get into things that are not healthy for us. I'll give you an example of something that is not healthy for us, actually. This kind of unilateral idea that we moved from agriculture, from pastoralism and or hunter-gatherism, are permaculture, things that are these early modes of human subsistence and or even sometimes flourishing, into agriculture where our bone density dropped, etc. People often make this teleological argument about that we had to do it, and maybe there is some sense in which to get enough calories in the population we did have to do it. I don't know. Or at least to build relative social surplus, right? But here's one thing we never talk about when we talk about that in transition. We know for a fact that in a lot of those transitions, from pastoralism to agriculturalism, etc., the people who were made to do the agriculture were enslaved.
Yeah.
Like they didn't choose that life. So, but even when they did, if they did do it voluntarily, there is usually a really aggressive myth to get people to do it. And that's a crucial thing to talk about. Now, I combine that with an insight from a book that is generally considered to be conservative, and I don't think it is. It is Robert Edgerton's Six Societies Challenging the Myth of Primitive Harmony, which is not saying that all quote primitive societies are bad. What he's saying is, no, there are human societies that have pretty profound ills that are not modern. And when we study them, we see high levels of cortisol. We see high levels of stress. We see people who report, things they view as horrible, like certain kinds of human sacrifice. Trigger warning, institutionalized, explicit as in not hidden from general society rape.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And we have, Egerton demonstrates it is not, people do not flourish in those conditions, period. Not, just because people are primitive and they do these kinds of things does not mean that most of the people in those societies are flourishing. There are societies where people flourish and societies where people don't.
Right.
And
because we know because we can construct stories and have narratives with our language about what constitutes human flourishing, and we can understand what human flourishing is, we are able to sort of understand, okay, this is what a flourishing human community looks like. This is what a flourishing human being looks like. What are those dispositions that allow one to be a flourishing human being, i.e., to actualize their uniquely human powers as a human being? Those dispositions are what we call the virtues. That does not mean these are the behaviors are going to live a guaranteed good life, because as we all know, like, there are plenty of good human beings who have bad ends, whether through, I don't know, sickness or through like bad acts performed upon them. But what virtue ethics essentially says, and what McIntyre argues, is that there are dispositions within both communities and individuals, and common goods and individual goods, that we can definitely say this is what a good community and this is what a flourishing individual looks like, and these are the behaviors and dispositions that lead one to flourish.
And so what this pushes back against communitarianism, before people don't get what we're getting at, they're not all communitarians, but there is a subset of communitarians. One of the fun thing about communitarians, that's why we're talking about this. No communitarian I know will admit they're a communitarian. I think I say I'm a communitarian, but even I put a hashtag, like, I'm a communitarian socialist, and also there's a hashtag on communitarian, and I don't believe all communities are created equal. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I might, so for example, there are people who will say, well, people didn't know any better in the Mexica community, that's the Aztecs, when they were doing that mass amounts of human sacrifice. Human sacrifice has been a norm in Mesoamerica. And I'm like, but it was a norm for enforcing empires. Let me tell you how the Spanish actually won that. It wasn't the gun. Their guns were shit. It wasn't even the steel sword, which was admittedly a lot better. It wasn't their numbers, and it wasn't their science, because for 15th century science, like, let's be real here. And in fact, honestly, the Mexica were probably more scientifically advanced than the Spanish. They built a living island and put a giant monolithic city on it in the middle of a lake out of nothing. But you know why the Spanish won? I mean, I'm sure you know, but it's because, like, most of the other indigenous tribes were sick of being farmed for sacrifices.
They hated the Aztecs.
They hated their guts and sided with the Spanish. Now, they immediately regretted that, but a lot of the Nahua speakers who were not Mexica sided with the Spanish, right?
Yeah.
So this is just to illustrate that it wasn't because they were stupid. It wasn't because the Spanish did trick them, but it wasn't because the Spanish set out to even trick them, or they converted them to Christianity or any of that. It's that Mexica society was an imposition, and it was incredibly violent, and it maintained a lot of its power base through sacrifice, and which people really wanted to stop.
Right.
And you can't bracket that out. And I also think one thing I think McIntyre is good on is not sugarcoating. Like, he's not one of these lapsarians who thinks, oh, everything was good before capitalism. No, capitalism from him is ultimately bad. I mean, he talks about that quite a bit. I mean, he does have a slightly Marxist view, and he doesn't see it as just bad. But not like most societies for him are at best neutral, and a lot of them are actively bad, and that has nothing to do with capitalism, although he'd probably include capitalism as a bad one. He doesn't see moral crisis and moral collapse as unique to capitalism.
Right. No, yeah, I mean, this is the big thing with McIntyre is that the notion that you brought up earlier about they didn't know any better or they didn't know, they were just raised into it. McIntyre would strongly disagree with the person who would have that thought, because McIntyre's whole thing is like, we are not termites. We are not just a collective hive mind, so to speak. We are rational thinking individuals. Like, you can take these traditional societies, and there are people who fit on a very wide spectrum of how they feel about certain social practices. For instance, look at the rise of chattel slavery in like North America. There are many people who said it was bad, and not just black freedmen either. There are many white people in the South, even up to like the 1810s, 1820s, who were fairly vocal about how bad slavery was for their society and how inhumane it was.
It was rare, but it was not unheard of, and
it was not unheard of. And this is a thing that McIntyre. This is a book of essays. One of my friends did a book club on McIntyre. It's a wonderful essay called "Social Structures and Their Threat to Moral Agency," where McIntyre tackles the question of the people who basically did those Nazi atrocities, who sat at Nuremberg, where McIntyre essentially concludes, yes, they had to do it because it was their job, but they're ultimately responsible because even though when you go into your job, when you go into that sphere of work in which you have to alienate all those different aspects of yourself that are not congenial to performing your function, you make that choice to do that. You make the choice to not feel bad for those Jews who are going onto those train cars. You make the choice into going into that work. Yes, history does make men, and it presents them with these social relations and these conditions that are not of their own making. But men also make history.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think this is the continuity with McIntyre and his Marxism, but also there is this Aristotelianism, there is this deeper problem. I think one of the things that he would probably kind of grok is, I think, in Marxism and Christianity, one of the things that he talks about is Marxism is one of the fully instantiated alternative systems to liberalism that actually also doesn't predate it. It emerges from it, but it really becomes a separate thing, which is something I believe too. And that, however, that he still thinks that it has this... he thinks that Marxism does have a naive view of rationality and of science.
Yeah.
And that's not something he drops. And so, and I go back and forth on that. Like, I had the, people may know this. There's a whole other podcast where I was basically trying to figure out if Marxism could have ever been called a science. And my answer is basically not really. Like, there are scientific elements to it. Sure, there's also non-scientific elements to it. By the way, I'm not sure science, qua science, can be called a science in the way science wants to be called a science either. And I'm not some loosey-goosey postmodernist, post-structuralist who doesn't believe the word science has any meaning. Like, I've just been pointing out to people that, like, when you tell me that there's a scientific method, which one are you referring to?
Right.
Like science is an embodied tradition, but its gatekeeping between other things is actually clear in some cases, such as physics, but very unclear in a whole lot of others, such as, say, psychiatry, where there are
social sciences. Yeah.
And it's not to say the social sciences aren't sciences. That's where I don't get on that train, but I do think we have to critique them for pretending, for example, that their physics, or when they get slightly smarter, that their biology. Like, I also get really annoyed when I talk to like mathematicians or physicists or biologists or whatever, and they try to reduce all social sciences to their field. And I'm like, well, that's trying to say that all biology is chemistry, but all chemistry is really physics, even though, yes, physics is definitely relevant to chemistry and thus relevant to biology. I don't actually know much about animals just by knowing their chemical signatures. So, the order of complexity really matters, and I think McIntyre would probably have a similar thing. And he also thinks, he's highly influenced by Lakatos, so he thinks that, like, when we talk about science, we're talking about reason in a set of terms that are defined by the science. Like, biology wants to understand this thing. Its terminology and its methods may come from outside, but it's also coming from the community itself in the pursuit of what it is doing. And so attempts to abstractify that are going to be hard, because you're going to have to ask yourself, well, what does, Lakatos's criterion, does the operational definitions make sense? Are there agreed upon frameworks? This, that, and the other. But Lakatos basically throws out the idea we can have a meta framework or a clear demarcation rule in the same way that McIntyre throws out we can have run rule to generate morality. Like, that's just, this is a silly pursuit. Like, it's taking Occam's razor to a logically fallacious point in and of itself.
Right.
So I think that there's so much to talk about with McIntyre. I mean, he's a hard figure to wrap your mind around, part of which is because he seems to think that why we can't, and it's not that he would claim to be beyond left and right either, because anyone who claims that you should probably not trust. He's not claiming to be beyond left and right. He's claiming that, like, neither side in the current context actually has a good handle on human flourishing. So talking about this in these terms, in these post-French Revolutionary terms, all the time does not always really help you understand much. And I am actually sympathetic to that, even though I do think left and right have orientational meanings in some sense. Although anytime I've ever sat down and tried to get someone to pin down what is the definition of the left and what is the definition of liberal and what is the definition of the right, I have always found their definition lacking.
I take a Wittgensteinian route to it. You know how Wittgenstein, like, basically give your viewers context. Wittgenstein is someone who McIntyre takes a lot from.
I take a lot from too, but I keep that quiet.
No, of course. And his whole thing is talking about how language can be kind of constituted of what he calls language games, where, like, it's a way of participating in a form of life. And, like, one rejoinder to that he addresses in the philosophical investigations is, well, what's a game? What's the thing that unites all games? And Wittgenstein says, well, you can't really find the thing that unites all games. Like, there's not really a set thing that unites everything. It's more like families of resemblances. Like, baseball resembles football, but neither resembles singing, which can be a kind of game that can be cooperative, but sometimes isn't sometimes is just performed by oneself. And I take that view with, like, the left and the right. When someone's like, well, the left and the right have these two very different understandings of what human flourishing is. And I think a lot of people can agree with that. And I agree with that as well. But I think trying to nail down, this is the formula to determine what the right's conception of flourishing is, and the left's, I think, is a bit of a dead end, because the left and the right is constituted of many different traditions.
Yeah, I used to even think that maybe, okay, the left was I used to take this, like, early Kowakovsky. I'm going to say his name right because I've been practicing. I usually call him Kolakowski. But Kowakovsky stance that the left is negationist, but towards building something for the future, whereas the right is preservationist. But even that orientation isn't really totally true. I mean, like if you read even someone as early as de Maistre, it becomes clear that no, the right isn't necessarily preservationist at all.
Yeah. Or like when I got into a bit of a tiff with a conservative Catholic because they were saying like all conservatives are basically those who stand for tradition and stand for orthodoxy and preserve against leftists who want to, do the opposite. And I say, okay, was Lenin a conservative? Was Stalin a conservative? Because they want to preserve the core tenets of Marx.
Well,
are they conservative?
Hannah Arendt says yes, but I think that's a ridiculous answer.
Yeah.
I do think there are certain orientations of power in the status quo and that family of resemblances you can call right and left. That leftists want. Well, I keep saying that, but I can think of examples where that's not true.
It's tough, isn't it?
Right. Like I was like, leftists generally want a more egalitarian, or at least less arbitrary set of hierarchies and power structure. But then I'm like, yeah, but not always. Like, and when we get to liberalism, and I've told people before when they get mad, like, well, conservatives, I think Ashley Frawley said, scratch a conservative and you find a classical liberal. And I'm like, yeah, that's because almost everybody's a liberal. That doesn't actually tell you anything.
Yeah.
But also, you're using one definition of liberal and implying another. And by liberal in our society in America, due to the legacy of anti-communism and the Cold War, liberal for us means progressive, which itself is a confused term, but we kind of know what that means. And right means conservative. And by our conservatives, generally, that either means white supremacist or nationalist or libertarian, but it does not generally mean like a blood and soil monarchist who wants a theocracy, although some Protestants want a kind of theocracy sometimes. So, even there, when I'm trying to define these terms, it's hard to do. But one of the things that I pointed out, to people in the past when they go, well, the right and, the left in America is really the right in Europe. And I'm like, except for the hard right in Europe, which is righter than anything viable on the American political spectrum at all.
Right.
Like, there's nobody who's trying to restore the Habsburgs in the United States who's not considered kind of a loon.
Right. And this is where McIntyre is useful because, McIntyre is very much into, we have to talk about left and right historically. And he says this in response to, say, some conservatives who say there is a strong conservative tradition that goes back to before Edmund Burke or comes back to Edmund Burke. But then you have people like Eric Hobsbawm who show like, well, I mean, the conservative view of the revolution, as modern conservatives have it these days, doesn't really show up in the historiography until like the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, I mean, basically the conservative tradition from Burke to Eliot is invented by Russell Kirk.
Right, exactly.
Like most tradition, I mean, this is one of the things where I get all Hobsbawm-y, but I'm like, most traditions like that are invented anyway. Like they're always post hoc rationalizations.
And this is where McIntyre, in one of the symptoms of a decaying community, is a community that insists upon itself because of its age. I think in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, he brings up Thucydides with the like conservatives who ironically are now aware of like a decaying set of social practices whose political program is now, we have to go back to thinking unreflexively about those social practices and unreflexively accepting those social practices. The irony being that in saying we have to unreflexively embrace these practices that are now decaying, you're not actually doing that. You're self-aware. You're in an aware fashion trying to resurrect or prop up these practices that are dying. Where if you're essentially saying like, oh, a thing is really dying, if you're saying, guys, we have to preserve the thing that's dying.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, that's also something that Demestra actually argues, but he takes it in a very, very different way. Like he's like, but Demestra's whole point is like anything that's trying to conserve something has become aware of its instantiation, and because of that, it's already losing.
Right.
Like, and thus, like the demonic horde of the French Revolution is actually still doing God's work despite of itself, according to Demestra. Demestra's weird though, because he's like, as Catholic as he is, he also like is one of the first Catholic thinkers who's really, really, really insistent on like there's no such thing as human universality.
Yeah.
So these figures are actually really important to kind of understand in European thinking. And I think McIntyre, one of my things about McIntyre that I always tell people when people are like, well, are you Catholic? And I'm like, no, but in fact, I'm not at all. Nor do I limit myself to examples from the Western world. I'm very interested in, like when I talk about the ancient world, for example, and antiquity, even though Rome comes up a lot because we talk about it in the way that capitalism developed. And my big question about why didn't Rome just go directly to capitalism? Why are there these weird forms that we kind of hodgepodge and call feudalism that emerge, where like there's an informal relation and there's kind of a government but not really, and like but one of my main criticisms of Marx until very late in his life is he really does not deal with non-European societies.
Right.
And so I very much try not to do that, because I think like yes, there is something necessarily Eurocentric about Marx's project because capitalism as we know it developed in Europe. But we don't have to stop with that. We don't have to do the Asiatic despotism, here be dragons to the rest of the planet, or take on a Whiggish Enlightenment notion that is naive and I'm not even entirely sure consistent with all of Marx's life.
Yeah.
And there is a certain kind of Marxist right now, and yes, my listeners, if you are one of them, I am chastising you, who pushes this and then wonders why their politics seems impossible, because I'm like, well, your notion of what a human being is just wrong.
Right.
Like, we are not Homo economicus, who also just happens to come by a set of universally obvious bourgeois rights that exist because we've always really had them, but now we're at a certain point of development where we can finally deliver on them. Yet somehow we never do.
Yeah.
So
I think like McIntyre has helped me engage with the Black radical tradition, like Du Bois, James Baldwin, and who is the fella who wrote how Europe underdeveloped Africa?
Walter Rodney.
Walter Rodney, yes, because they do a good job of vitalizing the Marxist tradition by not negating what Marx wrote, but by building upon and transcending what Marx wrote and trying to understand, say, Africa and Asia. In fact, McIntyre, one of his big things throughout a lot of his later work, ever since After Virtue, is saying that, again, the way one knows that a tradition is dying out is the inability to incorporate other traditions into itself or to understand those traditions in its own terms. And this is what I see a lot of, say, and this is very inside baseball, like Twitter Stalinists or Twitter Leninists who talk and write as though it's still like 1914 Moscow.
Yeah, this is to me. This is not just a failure from the McIntyre's perspective; it's also a failure from the Marxist perspective. Because even by
Yes.
any Marxian definition, material conditions, you don't exist in those. Like
Yeah.
you're not. I'm not even sure there is a society on Earth that actually would replicate the precise conditions of either Russia or China in the semi-periphery or periphery at the time of the early 20th century today. Like
Yeah.
I don't know of societies that are like that. Definitely not any that are that big yet that underdeveloped. Like
There's a good book I still need to. I think it's by his last name's Haywood. It's about Civil War Spain,
mm-hmm.
and he essentially talks about the social conditions of like basically why the Leninists failed in Spain, and it basically is chalked up to like a lot of the Leninists basically saying, okay, if we close our eyes and if we blur our eyes enough, Spain kind of looks like Tsarist Russia. Therefore, we should act as though it's Tsarist Russia. And so a lot of the Leninists alienated a lot of peasants who had very different relationships with the Catholic Church than, say, a lot of the Russian peasants had with the Orthodox Church. And doing all of these different kind of maneuvers that was backfired on them massively.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens when you treat Marxism as a doctrine.
Yeah, well, I also have this with ultra leftists when they're like, "I'm an invariant." I'm like, if you're invariant, you're already like wrong.
Sounds like an X-Men term. I'm an invariant.
I mean, it's a Bordigas term, you know what that means. But like, it's like, no, I know the rational program, and it doesn't change. Okay, you know, and to me, I didn't even get to this from a McIntyre perspective. I got it from a Lakatoshian's perspective. But to me, it's like you're making these categories rigid because you lost, and dealing with and changing your practice is too hard. So you're going to remove your categories from practice altogether, which also means they don't really mean anything.
You're going to be an armchair guy. You're just going to be a guy in the armchair, not doing anything.
Right. And this is another point for McIntyre, but I also think it's important for Lakatosh too. These are things you do.
Yeah.
These are not just things you believe.
Yeah.
And actually, this is sort of McIntyre's kind of crypto chastising of Protestant Christians. Because there's some of that too. We don't get into that here because we're Marxist and we don't really care about. Well, you might care about it because
I would care.
I was about to say you're actually Catholic, and I am not a Christian, but I will tell you, if I have a bigotry other than against the English, it is against Protestants.
Oh boy.
I don't trust Protestants as far as I can throw them. But
Georgia boy, born and raised over here.
Yeah, I grew up with Protestants. So that's part of the why. But no, I mean, to be fair, and I think this is actually particularly interesting about a paradox in, like, say, evangelical Christianity. Because on one hand, there's a tendency in evangelical Christianity to reduce Christianity not even to creeds or dogmas, but to mere basic belief.
Yeah.
On another hand, however, the only reason it has been successful against, like, mainline Protestantism, and not always that, it is declining rather rapidly these days, is that it actually has an embodied practice with embodied things where people do things together, and it incorporates most elements of your life, like the football team and etc. And this is one of my like real big angers back in the DSA debates when people would be like, "Oh, the left is not a church," and I'd be like, "No, it's not." But also, like, churches succeed and you don't. Have you ever asked yourself why? So, like, maybe the left is not a philosophical debating group on Twitter is perhaps also something that you should be saying simultaneously, because, well, no, we are not a church. There are things that churches do that socialists used to do that we don't do anymore, and thus it's a problem. Now, some of that I think is like and this is why I've become more and more. I've actually become more sympathetic to this point of McIntyre and after virtue, even though I am less sympathetic to the religious elements of it. Not gonna lie, but is the bowling alone, Anton Jaeger description of general society right now, where like mass politics seems impossible because mass life seems really, really hard, right?
Yeah.
And that makes doing much of anything very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And if you're a leftist and you don't really address that, you're going to have some real problems, I think.
Yeah. And to kind of go back to your point about Marxism or being a leftist is not something you think, it's something you do. I'll relate it to a personal experience of mine. A few years ago when I was in DC, I was doing DSA stuff, doing housing organizing, and it was in a predominantly undocumented, like immigrant community, mostly Spanish speakers, some Middle Eastern immigrants, but for the most part, English was one of several languages amongst the residents. And we were doing this kind of, we were on one of the lawns or something, and we were passing out food or cans of food. And a lot of the residents were coming in, and we were having a difficult time talking to them because they were like, they only knew Spanish. And one of the women, one of the residents of the apartment complex, was like a single mother, came up and was like, just started helping us translate. And that made such a huge impact on me, because, it's one thing to say like, oh, the proletariat is a has its own self activity. It's like an active, vital force. But it's another thing to see that in action, where like you see like, oh, these mostly white collar kind of professionals coming into this community trying to do tenant organizing, and then several members of the community helping us do that and take leadership of that. Like, that made a huge impact on me. And I think that dovetails with McIntyre and Marx's whole thing about theory informing praxis and praxis informing theory. And if you, this is a very real type of person who they lean so hard into theory and lean so hard into the PDFs, but at the same time can barely order a plate of eggs and bacon at Waffle House without stuttering and losing their mind.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think concurrently, just to put the other spin on this, the destruction of working class communities is a very real and has very real effects, and you can't just romanticize that away because it is a destruction of a way of life.
Yeah.
I talk about like a lot of times, like, I'm ambivalent about family abolition because on one hand, I actually think we've actually achieved a lot of the stuff that Marxists meant by it when they brought it up 200 years ago, and socialists in general. On the other hand, I have seen what has happened in this post-family society where like partner stability and support for children in terms of marriage in our society, because that's the legal thing we rely to, but also in general, even beyond marriage. Like I'm not crying about the end of the bourgeois marriage in the way Christopher Lasch is, for example, really have become class goods in a way that they kind of weren't for most of the 20th century. And this has pretty profound effects on things like the proletariat, because I don't know, last time I checked, it's at least until very recently was like majority female. Now it's gone back to not being, but it's still pretty close. And weirdly now I've read Axios and liberals talk about like, oh, well, the progress of women entering the workforce has stopped at 70%. It's stalled. I wonder why. And we need them because we're losing workers. And I'm like, of course, that's what you're thinking. And you don't even have the sense to not say that out loud.
Marxist feminists enter the chat.
Yeah. And I I think about that because I do think we've made a lot of these communities very hard for them to sustain themselves, and they had adapted to certain degrees, and that has been largely undone, particularly after deindustrialization, even before you get to neoliberalism and that period in between when you start seeing this crop up at the end of the 60s and the 70s. And that's not because all the old ways we had adjusted during the Fordist period were good. I don't think that.
No.
I'm just saying that, like, for a lot of people, the experience was worse. This is one of the points that Lash makes that I actually do kind of agree with. I don't agree with the way he frames it, but like when we talk, people can go back and listen to it, not on the podcast, but if you find the episode where we talk about this particular essay by Lash for 4 hours, and I go into a rant about how he doesn't really understand anthropology and family and kinship because he's very much stuck on a very particular model of that from the early 20th century. But that's, you can go back. I'm not going to relitigate that rant. So from people who also think that I'm an uncritical Lashian, you're just wrong.
Like, and in the disillusion of like these kind of traditional forms of community, I think that dovetails very well in the animal-human distinction of Marx and McIntyre, because to kind of touch on Marx first, Marx essentially says that rationality does not, it's not just a thing that is added onto our humanity, but it's something that fundamentally changes the way in which we like engage with life itself. For instance, when we eat food, or when an animal eats food, Marx basically kind of says it's to satiate its appetites, its immediate appetites. Human beings with irrationality it does not enhance our senses, but it allows us to enjoy things in a deeper way that animals fundamentally cannot. For instance, eating as a fundamentally social activity. We do not eat because it satiates us, or simply because it satiates us, but we eat because we enjoy it. We enjoy it in the company of others. We enjoy the way the food has been cooked or arranged. We enjoy it in an infinite number of ways that is helped by our rationality and our being in a community with others. This is why Marx says that humans are the only animals that are able to comprehend and build things according to the laws of beauty. And with capitalism, with Marx, to use a quote from the manuscripts, it makes our human functions animal. And what he means by that is we see eating and drinking and working not as goods in and of themselves, but as means to an end, means of life,
means production of value,
to produce a production of value, and also a means of like reproducing ourselves. For instance, like when your workplace, if you're especially a white collar professional, takes an interest in you attending happy hours or having a good work-life balance, that's not because they're being nice, but it's because primarily they want to make sure you're able to get up in the morning and perform work at your best. And what capital does with like in the disillusion of community is it negates those aspects of our humanity that makes us human, and makes us able to enjoy life in a unique, rich way that animals cannot.
All right. And so tie this into McIntyre and we'll wrap up.
Yeah. And with McIntyre, this is essentially what the virtues are for. They are goods internal in themselves. And these are goods and these are dispositions that at the end of the day allow us to align ourselves with our nature as being dependent, rational animals, that allow us to be better able at being in a community and sustaining a community and being in the fellowship of others. But that doesn't mean like the common good is like the greatest good, though it is a great good. What it does mean is by being able to contribute to the common good, we are able to better actualize our individual goods. When the community is healthy, when everybody can come to the dinner table at their fullest selves, giving themselves to others, giving themselves to community, they are better able to enjoy the food that comes to the table, and they're better able at appreciating the fine artistry that comes into making the food, preparing the food, serving the food, talking about the food with others. And this is where McIntyre gets a lot from Marx, who both get a lot from Aristotle, and why how like capital in compartmentalizing life leads to the fragmentation of the self. And the more we see ourselves as fragments into all these different spheres of life, the less able we are at living well integrated lives, which means we are less able at living lives that enjoy and execute our specifically human forms of rationality.
Right. So to sum up what I think is important for my listeners, I think all this is important, but for people who ask me all the time, well, what are we to do? And when I don't answer them and they say, well, you're a grifter, you're not telling us what to do, you're just trying to make money off. And I get mad. Part of the reason why I can't give you that is because you're asking for a rule from the context of this parasocial quasi-community. Yeah. Not saying that we don't have community-like elements here. We do. I'm not saying there aren't real friendships here. There are. There are times where parasociality actually does trip over in the real sociality. And there's no way to live without parasocial relationships. That's how we think. It's part of symbolic kinship, my friends. That's not my point. My point is, however, because practice is embodied, I can give you some guidelines on how to build good practices, but you know your environment, you know your life, you know your workplace, you know the community of workers you live with, you know them better than me. And if you don't, that's the only advice I can give you. And not only should you know them, you should know everything around them. And if you don't, then this becomes something you embody. I cannot give you a rule for practice for the same reasons here. Let me give you an example of that and how it relates to virtue. I can give you a model for how to be strong. I can maybe even give you rules, although different bodies are going to be different in different contexts, so those rules are going to be variable. There's going to be play there, right? We all know that. We know it when we're talking about physical stuff. Why don't you know it when we're talking about social and mental and political stuff? I can help you. I can coach things for you. You can have models. You can learn from the past. You can learn from history. But your instantiation and the virtues and things you need to do to build a program, all I can give you is orientations and tell you where to find examples. And that's it. That's what I can do. And you don't want me to try to do more, because if I'm trying to do more, let's be honest, I'm manipulating you.
Yeah. And it comes back to you begin to reify like these rules. I mean, we going back to the CLR James perspective. Mm-hmm. What makes a good cricket player, what makes a good football player is not one who follows the rules of football. It's one who is able to be a good football player and to score points and to play the game of football well. Same thing with life. We could give you rules on how to live life, but those rules cannot be reified. Following those rules does not make you a good person. In order to be a good person, you have to live your life, and you have to live through like your form of community, and being able to basically practice morality, not as a set of rules, but as a technique. And McIntyre, if you want a good book to read about how to, be more, to be better able at doing these things, this book is great. Read this book. This book is great because it sums up all of McIntyre's life work essentially, and does so in a great way.
All right, so Jules, being selfless and somehow very Catholic, you have ended the show with a plug that wasn't for anything you did. So, as a dirty petite bourgeois teacher, I'm now going to let you plug anything for yourself.
You can follow me on Twitter, but I have a Substack. Should I send you the link? You could link it in your YouTube.
Yeah, I'll link it in my YouTube show notes. I think I have in the past, but definitely send me the link again. And you guys should support Jules, but read this book.
It's wonderful.
Yeah,
you should read it too, Varn. I know you haven't read it yet. It's wonderful.
No, it is not. It's actually, I was like, oh man, you're gonna get me on like one of the two, because I've read McIntyre, you haven't too. We were just talking about that before the show, but apparently I have not read new McIntyre that you haven't. So, not to make this one off. And by the way, guys, just as another side note, I haven't nor can I read everything. I read a lot. I read something like 100 books a year, usually.
Yeah.
And increasingly less than them comic books as I get older. I used to read like 200 books a year, but 120 of them were comic books. But I can't read everything, and nor should I, and nor should you want me to. Again, the best way to think of self-improvement is not to think of it as self-improvement. It's to think of it as improvement for those things and those people of which you value.
Yeah.
Right? Like similar with politics, similar with anything else. If you can take anything from tonight, model the virtues that help you achieve what you think will be good for yourself. You have to be included in that. Don't let anyone sell you out and manipulate you and think you have to negate yourself in this. But for everything else that you care about. And some of that's not going to look like one of the things that I've been big on recently to get people to understand is like a lot of politics does, like, if you're really interested in being political, a lot of it does not look political. It just won't. Because a lot of it is building communities, building trust, building something more than symbolic agreement, having something to base a platform. If you believe in a platform or a program, which, I kind of do think programmatic self-interested unity is important, and it's one of the real forms of unity, but that has to come out from people. You can't impose it, or it's not real there either. Like,
right.
So definitely read that. Read After Virtue. Don't listen to what all the right-wingers say about it. I will say this. We've been all super gushy about McIntyre. I don't think either. Well, Jules may think he's perfect. I don't
think he's perfect, but I think he's great.
But I also don't think he's like a crypto-conservative philosopher. I kind of think he's something else entirely, and it's very hard to put him on that spectrum. But he has very Marxian ideas. If you have liberal ideas grafted onto Marxism, he's going to be a hard take.
Yeah, he's above all, McIntyre at the end of his life is very concerned with writing philosophy that is applicable to the struggles of the everyday average person. Because McIntyre, if there's one thing that he really is against, it is armchair philosophy, because he believes that philosophy is something that is lived through and is something that informs praxis, and praxis informs that philosophy. And his big thing is that practicing the virtues and living through your community honestly makes you, it helps make you a better thinker, because the very skills that make one a better person, a more engaged person, a more present person in one's community, are the same skills that help one be a more critical thinker and grappling the problems that face the real and perceived issues that people in your community are facing. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Catholic Claude.
Yeah. In the thing. So you snuck that back in your final statement. Good on you, Jules. You're getting good at this after this is your 4th visit.
Yeah, I love coming on here. You love having me on, apparently.
I do. Weirdly, you and I know each other through the same person, of which we are kind of bet nars with their general philosophy.
I love him anyway.
Good old Nico and his Althusserian structuralism, which for different reasons, actually, between me and you is both kind of anathema.
Yeah.
He gets me to take Althusser slightly more seriously, but only slightly. All right, and with that note, we're going to end the show. Thank all your listeners. Go and follow Jules. He's fun, and with that, good night.